It's a full house. I'm reminded of when you get on the plane and they say buckle your seatbelts because we may encounter turbulence. I've known Gary for about 8 or 10 years. We were trying to figure it out. First heard about him when a friend of mine sent me this book called Good Calories, Bad Calories, and he said, I think you'd find this provocative, and it sat on my bookshelf for 6 months because I thought, I don't want to read about good calories and bad calories. A calorie is a calorie. And then I started reading it, and as I think you'll learn, Gary makes some very compelling arguments for at least questioning the underlying etiology of obesity. I invited him to the NIH to give a talk about 8 or 10 years ago when he packed the house, and it was a provocative lecture then, and I'm sure it will be a provocative lecture today. His background is that he grew up in Rochester, New York, went to Harvard where he played football, and then for many people of our generation, and studied physics, not just played football, studied physics. And then, like many people in our generation, he read All the President's Men, and he thought, that's what I want to do. But Nixon resigned, and he thought, now what am I going to do? He still went to Columbia School of Journalism and became interested in what he and many others were convinced would be some Nobel Prize-winning work taking place at CERN in Geneva. And he convinced the PAI to let him come and spend the year with them. And as Gary was observing all these things, he was seeing some science that he didn't think was quite right, and wrote a book about that called Nobel Dreams. And that sort of labeled him as a scientific skeptic, and initially his work was in the more hard sciences, but then a few years ago he became interested in medical science and epidemiology, and one thing led to another, and now he's here. So I think you're going to be intrigued by his thinking. He's a very critical thinker, and he'll challenge many paradigms, and we'll have time for discussion afterwards. So Gary, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Just a quick note about the football thing. I'm obsessed these days with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So if I misspeak, you know what I'm thinking. Okay, I am a journalist, investigative journalist. I come at things from a historical perspective. This is one of the things the physics community taught me, is why do you know what you know and question everything. So when I got into first public health and saw some of the problems with the science in public health, and then got into a long investigative piece I did for the journal Science, first on the question whether salt causes high blood pressure, and then that led me into the question of dietary fat and whether a hard, healthy diet is low fat. And I spent a year on a year each, writing about these pieces, interviewing for the fat story 140 people for one magazine article. And the end result was that I was very disappointed, very dismayed with the quality of the science being done in nutrition. And that led me eventually into obesity. So what I'm going to basically, I then had the opportunity to spend 5 years of my life, in effect, recreating the science of obesity historically, to understand how we came to certain beliefs that seemed to be set in stone. And this happened when the internet made it possible for the first time in history to, in effect, get every single primary source. So at one point, now you could download most of them, and Google Books will overload you. But back in the early 2000s, I had 5 researchers scattered around the country who all they did was go to libraries and get references for me. And then I recreated the science of obesity from conference proceedings, which libraries didn't want, and you could basically see what people were presenting. So this is what you're going to hear is what I learned. And none of this when I went in, I was aware of none of this. I think I had a completely open mind, other than that I was exceedingly skeptical about the quality of the science that was being done in these fields. So the context, just to keep in mind, the obesity epidemic, aside from being a national or international crisis, is evidence that there's something going on more than genetics. Clearly, obesity rates have been rising. It goes along with the diabetes epidemic that's more frightening. If you believe the CDC numbers, which I don't particularly, but if you do, and we took this back to 1960, you would have a 900% increase in diabetes prevalence in 50 years, and I don't know why people aren't terrified by that. Maybe they are. So we want to understand what causes these disorders, what the dietary trigger is of the obese and diabetic phenotype. And with obesity comes a cluster of chronic diseases. Obviously, you guys are all too aware of all this. So stroke, heart disease, gallbladder disease, hypertension, neurodegeneration, including Alzheimer's risk is increased with obesity and diabetes, asthma, cancer. Conventional wisdom, right, is that something about the obese state or excess fat, maybe the inflammatory molecules released drives this metabolic diseases. An alternative causality would be that the same thing that causes the obesity causes the metabolic diseases and premature death. And so this talk is about the cause of obesity, why we get fat. And it could be about the cause of any of these metabolic diseases. It's easier to make these arguments with obesity. And I'm going to give you hypotheses. So here's the conventional wisdom. Fundamental cause of obesity avoids an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended. You could find a sentence like this on the website of virtually every public health organization in the world. Simply put, obesity is an energy balance disorder. I have friends in the field who have chairs in energy balance. Calories in greater than calories out. Very simply, we overeat. The biblical terms for this would be gluttony and sloth. That's the hypothesis for the cause of obesity. It's a multifactorial complex disease, but ultimately, calories in, calories out. We want to explain the obesity epidemic, too. Part of the job of scientists to explain the observations. So the conventional thinking there is basically as populations get more prosperous, as they get wealthier, you have more highly palatable, nutrient-dense food available, a toxic, obesogenic environment. This is how Kelly Brownell, formerly at Yale, now at Duke, described it. Cheeseburgers and French fries, drive-in windows and supersizes, soft drinks, candy, potato chips, etc. Few children walk or bike to school, so there's all these foods that make us basically eat too much and we exercise too little. So here's the hypothesis. Too much food, too little physical activity leads to overeating, energy in greater than energy out, and the end result is obesity and the obesity epidemic. And I like to start my lecture just to get a feel. How many of you kind of believe this is inherently correct? Be honest. Funny, I gave this talk at Tufts a few years ago when they didn't realize what they had gotten into by inviting me. And I asked that question, and nobody raised their hand. And I said, okay, then I don't have to continue with my lecture. Because I'm going to try to convince you that this isn't not only wrong, it's what Wolfgang Pauli, the great physicist, would have said, it's not even wrong. Okay? It's nonsensical. And it's almost, to me, this is the biggest thing. I was stunned by this. Biggest single mistake. I can't imagine a mistake of this magnitude being made. I can't imagine that it's still being made. I don't understand it despite devoting my whole life to understanding it. Okay, so that's the setup. I'm going to try and convince you that this is nonsense. So it's a hypothesis. It might seem like it's cut in stone, but it's a hypothesis. It's actually got a history. Fascinating. Like any hypothesis, it wasn't chiseled on stones. The two leading proponents in the U.S. of this hypothesis, or in the world, were Karl von Noorden, who was one of the leading German diabetologists of the late 19th, early 20th century, and Louis Newberg at the University of Michigan. And it came out of research on the laws of thermodynamics. So the second half of the 19th century, one of the great revelations in physics was the laws of thermodynamics. In the 1880s, Max Rubner in Germany demonstrated that they hold true for living organisms. He established the isodynamic law of calories, which we think of as a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. And in the 1890s, Atwater and Benedict actually spent a decade of their life showing that thermodynamics holds true for humans. They built metabolic chambers, they put humans in metabolic chambers, measured energy in and energy out. They said they knew it seemed obviously true, but it's interesting. They had to spend a decade of their lives demonstrating it, so they really knew what they thought was true, and then they could build on science from there. 1900s, von Noorden declares caloric imbalance as a cause of obesity. Okay, he says he ingests this as the early 1903, 1905. The ingestion of a quantity of food greater than that required by the body leads to an accumulation of fat and to obesity, should the disproportion be continued over a considerable period. And what's fascinating about this, and I actually didn't realize this when I wrote my first 2 books on this subject, I just finished a book on sugar. Modern nutrition dates to the late 1860s and the invention and journey of room-sized calorimeters, where you could measure energy expenditure in living, dogs or humans. And if you read books on the history of nutrition, that's the beginning of the modern science of nutrition. And for the next 50 years, all of nutrition was calorimetry, measuring energy in and measuring energy out, and vitamin and mineral deficiency diseases. Those were the tools they had available and the disorders they could study. And our thinking about the field was formed in that 50-year period because those were the only tools they had. And in science, as you know, the tools you have drive not only the answers you can get, but the questions you ask. So by 1920, we have this belief that obesity is an energy balance disorder. And if you think about the problem with sugar, the conventional thinking is it's empty calories. So empty means empty of vitamins and minerals, because that's what they were studying 100 years ago to 150 years ago, and calories are calorimetry. So all of this idea came out of the available technology. Now the problem is, there's 100 years of science that follows. And we locked in our thinking about obesity in 1910, 1920. So the entire science of endocrinology, basically born in the 1920s with the discovery of insulin, of growth hormone, medical doctors who were studying obesity had no idea about endocrinology. They didn't understand it. They had no true understanding of genetics and what it meant. And by the 1960s, after Yellow and Burson invent the radioimmunoassay, and you can now really have a revolution in endocrinology based on being able to measure these substances in the bloodstream, this idea that obesity was an energy balance disorder, by the 1960s, it's actually considered an eating disorder and studied mostly by psychologists. So one of the things I'm going to argue is we had 100 years of science, and we locked in our thinking of obesity, your thinking of obesity, based on the 1910 technology, which is almost unbelievable, but that's what happened. Okay, so more history. Louis Newberg comes along at the University of Michigan. He comes to this conclusion based on some research by a woman named Hilda Brooke, who I'm going to talk about later, that all obese persons are alike in one fundamental respect. They literally overeat. Hilda Brooke had done a series of studies at Columbia on obesity, pediatric obesity cases. She had mothers who said, my kids eat like birds. And she went into the homes and she studied the kids, and they all ate a lot. Okay, so Newberg says all obese persons, they literally overeat. Therefore, obesity is caused by either a perverted appetite, eating too much, or a lessened outflow of energy. And he's confirming what von Noorden had suspected. There's some problems with, so it's full body energy balance, basically energy in, energy storage, energy out. But you have this problem, which is if people overeat and they're not exercising, they're fat, which is a horrible disorder, why don't they adjust? Okay? I mean, overeating is a behavior, sedentary behavior is a behavior, why don't they adjust? In Newberg, you could see what Newberg looked like. I have questions about people who are built like him studying obesity. So why don't obese people compensate by eating less or exercising more? Because they suffer, said Newberg, from, quote, various human weaknesses such as overindulgence and ignorance. So you take a disorder that's in the body, a physiological defect, and now you put it in the brain. And say it's a behavior, it's overindulgence and ignorance, where the problem ultimately lies. And like I said, by the 1960s, you have psychologists like Mickey Stunker, very good people, dedicated scientists, studying this disorder from the perspective of an eating disorder. How can we get people to eat less? There were counterexamples. I mean, what do you do in science when you have a hypothesis? The first thing you do is you look for counterexamples, black swans. And you can find dozens of them if you go looking for them. Okay, and these are populations that are so poor that it's hard to imagine that people ate less, ate too much. Populations that have what's now called the dual or double burden of obesity and malnutrition, where you have obese mothers, obese aunts, obese women in the population, and malnourished, stunted children. And as you can see in this chart, this was some of those that I found in my research, going back to 1902. But 1928, the top, Sioux on the South Dakota Crow Creek Reservation. In 1927, the U.S. government did a study of the Native American reservations, said that the poverty on these reservations was so poor as to be unimaginable by the standards of the U.S. in the 1927. So you can imagine how poor it was. And yet, when the University of Chicago economists went to study the health on the population, they reported that 40% of the women, 10% of the men, and a quarter of the children were distinctly fat. Okay, 20% of the women, 25% of the men and children were extremely thin. This obesity in association with malnutrition and stunting, and there were obvious signs of malnutrition, deficiency diseases on the population. If you go down, Trinidad, 1963, Trinidad's having a malnutrition crisis. The U.S. government sends a team of researchers down to study, and they come back reporting that a third of the women over 25 are obese, and obese is a potentially serious medical problem. And the next year, a nutritionist from MIT goes down to study the diets and reports that the per capita daily diet for these obese women was less than 2,000 calories a day. Bantu pensioners in South Africa at the top, the poorest of a disenfranchised black population during the apartheid era. Mean weight of women over 60 was 165 pounds, and 30% of the women were severely overweight. This one at the bottom, Mexican Americans in Starr County, Texas. This is a population of oil field laborers and agricultural laborers. This is a hard-working, very poor Mexican population in 1981 on the border of Mexico. Okay, there was one restaurant in Starr County, Texas in 1981, a Mexican restaurant, and yet 50% of the women in their 50s are obese. So the question is, you can disassociate obesity from sedentary behavior. You can disassociate obesity from prosperity. You can disassociate it from, cheese curls and potato chips. But something was causing high levels of obesity in these populations. The question is what? This were available, obvious to people for 100 years, and we'll talk about some of those comments later. If eating too much makes you get fat, you should be able to eat less and control it. You don't wake up one morning obese. You gain a few pounds a year, 5 pounds a year, 10, somewhere along the line. You should be able to stop it by eating less. And yet, when you put people on calorie-restricted diets, the weight loss achieved is so small as to be clinically insignificant. This has been known for 50 years. Mickey Stunkard pointed this out in the 50s with studies. And you can ask yourself why it doesn't work. And Hildebrand, who again, Hildebrand was a German clinician who fled Germany. She was a Jew. She came over in 1933. She moved to New York in 1934, and she was walking around New York City in the heart of the Depression, the single worst year of the Depression, commenting to herself on how fat the children were. It was another example of poverty in association with obesity. She said not just fat, she said roly-poly fat kids. So she started the first clinical obesity center at Columbia, Pediatric Obesity Center in 1937 because of this. And she said about this idea that you should eat less. She said more than in any other illness, a physician treating the obese patient is called upon only to do a special trick to make the patient do something. Stop eating after it's already been proved that he can't do it. We all know you're supposed to eat less. It's clear, it's been known for hundreds of years that if you're too fat, try to eat less. You didn't need the laws of thermodynamics to come to this conclusion. And yet if it worked, you wouldn't have obese people. That was basically what she was saying. And in fact, in Germany, pre-World War II, they had terms for obesity. They were the people who were fat but could reduce their fat accumulation by eating less, and there are people for whom eating less didn't work, and they had different German terms for them that I can't remember, maybe because I played too much football. Exercising more also doesn't work. Okay, that's another problem. I could quote you meta-analyses to the size of this effect, but I find this about how small the effect of exercise on weight is, but I find this more compelling. 2007, the American Heart Association, the American College of Sports Medicine, put together joint physical activity guidelines, and they said this about the idea that increasing energy expenditure will lead to weight loss. They said it's reasonable to assume that persons with relatively high daily energy expenditures would be less likely to gain weight over time compared with those with low energy expenditures, which is equivalent logically to saying if I'm a couch potato, I'm less likely to gain weight over time if I become a marathon runner than if I remain a couch potato. And then they say so far data to support this hypothesis are not particularly compelling. Okay? And the interesting thing is this is a hypothesis that's roughly 100 years old. And in physics, where I grew up, they would have said if you spend a century mulling over a hypothesis, and the best you can say is that the data to support it are not particularly compelling, you should seriously consider the possibility that that hypothesis is wrong. Maybe you didn't test it right. So let me give you an example of how crazy this thinking is. And this I owe to a blogger in Sweden, one of the joys of the internet. I wish I could take credit for this. Let's say tonight, when Dave invited me to speak here, he also invited all of you to dinner. We're going to go to his house, and at his house we're going to have the 12 best chefs in Massachusetts. And it's like Top Chef on steroids. Okay, the best food you could imagine, course after course after course of that. And the invitation we sent out, come hear the lecture, come to Dave's house, this feast, bring your appetite. What would you do to make sure you got to Dave's house tonight hungry? You'd eat less, right, during the day. You'd maybe skip lunch or eat smaller portions. You'd certainly skip your snacks.
Exercise.
You might exercise more. You might, if you were going to work out, you're going to work out twice as much. You might say, Dave only lives 6 miles from here. Let's walk to his house and build up an appetite. Okay, remember the concept of building up an appetite? So then you could ask yourself, why is it that the two things that any normal human being would do to make sure they're hungry are the two things we tell obese people to do to lose weight? And then assume that hunger isn't an issue, that if we get them to work out, we're not getting them to build up their appetite. And if they then eat more, we could blame it on self-indulgence and gluttony. There's a problem with this thinking. Okay, energy imbalance. CDC says weight management is all about balancing the number of calories you consume with the number of calories your body uses or burns off. How many of you have ever gone to the gym, gotten on a treadmill or a Stairmaster or one of those gliders and looked at the calorie counter until you got to some number? Okay, so what does it mean to practice energy imbalance? And this, I'm going to give you a calculation that was done in 1937, originally by Eugene Dubois, who was a leading expert in metabolism in the U.S. By the way, I'm talking fast because I have a lot of ground to cover. Yeah. I have to shift your paradigm or consider getting you to shift in 45 minutes, and I have to talk fast. So I'm not trying to sell you something, although I am. Okay, typical adult's food intake, roughly 2,700 calories a day, average between men and women. That's equivalent to 1 million calories a year. It's 10 million calories in a decade. It's about 10 to 12 tons of food. Okay, so now you want to ask the question, how accurately do I have to balance calories in to calories out so that I don't gain 2 pounds a year? Because if I gain 2 pounds of fat a year, that's 20 pounds in a decade, it's 40 pounds in 2 decades. I'm going to go from being lean in my 20s to obese in my 40s, just like everyone does, and I want to stop that. So what's the daily, and this isn't in dispute. Forget the footnote, that was last year's New Yorker. These are old slides. Okay. The answer is 21 kilocalories a day. If I put 21 calories in my fat tissue that I don't burn, that's going to add up to 2 pounds of fat a year. It's a simple calculation. It's 8th grade mathematics. 20 calories a day times 365 days a year times 10 years divided by 3,500 calories per pound of fat is going to be 21 pounds in a decade, okay? So that's 20 calories in my fat tissue. So what I mean by that is if I eat, let's say I eat 2,700 calories a day, and I expend 2,680 of it, expend or excrete, and the remaining 20 end up in my fat tissue, I am doomed to get fat, okay? I will become obese. So that's, say that sort of 2,700 calories a day might be 150 bites of food. I'm going to expend 149 of them, and the 150th ends up in my fat tissue. So when you start thinking like that, it's interesting. What we want to know is, why do those 20 calories a day get trapped in the fat tissue? Because worrying about how much I eat and exercise is a little crazy considering how small this number is. So maybe instead of thinking of this as an energy balance disorder, we should start thinking of it as a fat trapping disorder. You know, when you think about global climate change, you've got energy coming into the atmosphere and energy leaving the atmosphere, and the problem is energy is getting trapped in the atmosphere. So it doesn't do any good to care about how much is coming in. It doesn't do us any good to care about how much is coming out, because we know that what's going out is the difference between what came in minus what's gotten trapped in the atmosphere and in the oceans. And we want to know, why is it trapped in the atmosphere? Here we want to know why the calories are trapped in the fat. 20 calories a day, that's all it takes, infinitesimal amount. 0.8% of what you eat is going to get trapped in your fat. You're going to get obese. And if it's 0.4%, you're still going to gain 10 pounds every year. And this is what Dubois said about it. He said, considering this number, there's no stranger phenomenon than the maintenance of a constant body weight under marked variation in bodily activity and food consumption. Okay, the question should be, if all it takes to get fat is to store 20 calories a day in your fat tissue, 1/100th of the amount you consume, maybe the question should be, why do some of us get fat, but why aren't all of us fat? Because there's no way we can balance our intake and our exercise to deal with that 20 calories. I would argue there's no way our brains can do it. Somehow it's got to be happening in our body. So there are other issues. And now I'm using photos from pre-World War II textbooks. Okay, so one of the metaphors here, one of the stories I learned in my research is that prior to World War II, all major science was done in Europe. Okay, when I did my first book at CERN, as Dave said, the European physicists used to say the greatest thing that ever happened to American science was Hitler. Because he drove all these brilliant Europeans who had pioneered all these fields of science to the US. So I'm going to mention some names. How many of you ever heard the name Schrodinger? Okay, Heisenberg, Einstein, Planck. All these great physicists, all Austrians, Germans, Europeans, we know them in physics. The equivalent in medicine were guys like von Norden. Did you ever hear that name before? I mentioned him earlier, or Bauer, okay, or Graf. These guys were brilliant. The interesting thing is during the war, some of those were also driven to the US, and we didn't want anything to do with it. I didn't know anything about this history when I started. In physics, we embraced the physicists because we had a Cold War and bombs to build and the Manhattan Project. We didn't even care if they were Nazis. If they could contribute to building bombs, we wanted them. And they ended up getting positions throughout the US. In medicine and public health, we wanted nothing to do with these people. So the first wave of immigrants who came over from Germany and Austria in '33, some of those got jobs, like Hans Krebs, Rudolf Schonheimer at Columbia, who later committed suicide, unfortunately. The ones who came over later, we wanted nothing to do with it. In fact, the Ivy League universities had policies in place to keep them from getting flooded by Jewish emigres from Europe. And one of the reasons the University of California, Berkeley is supposedly so great is because they embraced the Jews that these East Coast institutions didn't want. So what I'm going to give you now is the way the German and Austrian clinicians who pioneered the fields of endocrinology, genetics, metabolism, nutrition, all the fields relevant to obesity, thought about obesity. I'm going to channel them, and then we're going to get to that history. So the first thing they said is we know obesity has a genetic component. These are lean identical twins and obese identical twins. Now our energy in, energy out thing might tell us why the twins on the right are obese. They ate more than they expended, and the ones on the left practiced perfect energy balance, but it doesn't tell us why they have the same bodies. Obviously there's something determining where the fat accumulates. And this is a point they kept going back to. It's where the fat accumulates. It tells you something about fat accumulation and when the fat accumulates. Okay, our energy balance theory says nothing about it. Animal husbandry was another example they used in the textbook. These photos are obviously newer. So on the left you have a Jersey cow, which is a dairy cow. You can see the swollen udder. It's a very lean animal. And on the right you have an Aberdeen Angus, a very stocky, beefy beef cow. And you can see in the inset all the intramuscular fat. And you know that this is genetic because these are different species. And the question is, what are the genes controlling? Are they controlling how much these animals are eating and exercising? Or are they controlling maybe how they're partitioning fuels? You know, this animal takes in fuel and turns it into milk. Actually, maybe the process of turning it into milk drives all the fuel to it. We don't know why. But it's very inefficient to have the fuel accumulating here as fat or muscle, whereas this animal, we want it accumulating here. So maybe the genes that are determining whether an animal produces milk and is lean or produces fatty protein are fuel partitioning genes. The idea that they control how much they eat and exercise is a little inane. And when we look at animals, we can see that we're dealing with an entirely, even though it's quite likely, well actually we don't know in the case of these two animals which eats more. Because milk production, as with humans, is extraordinarily energy expensive. Sexual variations. You know, men get fat above the waist, women get fat below the waist, okay? The man actually doubled his risk of heart disease by getting fat above the waist. The woman didn't. But what do the calories they ate or exercised have to say about it? one of the things, by looking at where people get fat, you start asking the question, if I was studying out, let's say I took a fat cell off of her stomach and a fat cell off of his stomach and gave them the same intake and expenditure, I'm not going to know which is going to get fat and which isn't unless I know whether it came from the man or the woman. Okay, it's obviously, sex hormones obviously play a huge role. Here's another way, another localized fat distribution. Again, an example from the pre-World War II textbooks that this woman put on steatopigia, which is this classic genetic fat accumulation in African women because she ate too much or exercised too little? Or is there something else controlling fat accumulation that our energy balance hypothesis says nothing about? Puberty is a great example. Again, pre-World War II example, modern diagram. Boys and girls enter puberty with roughly the same amount of body fat. As they go through puberty, they both grow, they get bigger, they both take in more energy than they expend. Okay, which is clear because they're growing. The boys lose fat and gain muscle, and the girls gain fat and they gain it in very specific places. Not all over, but in very specific places that evolutionarily might have been driven to drive the boys crazy. So the question is, what do the calories have to do with it? We know they consumed more than they expended. They had to. They were getting bigger. They were getting heavier, but the boys lost fat and gained muscle, and the girls gained fat and they gained it in specific places. Obviously, growth hormones, insulin-like growth factor, are driving their growth. And sex hormones are determining whether or not it's fat or muscle. So why don't we think of this as a hormonal issue? Because at least in some areas, the women they leave puberty with about 50% more fat on their bodies than the men. But it's not because they ate more than they exercised. Okay, physics. This is why we think in terms of physics. I mentioned this, thermodynamics. First law of thermodynamics is the law of energy conservation. It's the one that's easy to understand. We see this in papers all the time. Change in energy storage, delta E is equal to E in minus E out. Change in fat mass, in this case, is equal to energy consumed minus energy expended. I have friends in the field, I have researchers who my not-for-profit funds who discuss the laws of thermodynamics in their papers on obesity, and they say, this tells us that somehow E in and E out regulate or determine or control delta E, fat storage. And it doesn't. This is a mistake, okay? There's no arrow of causality here. By that I mean, this law does not say that a system gets bigger because it takes in more energy than it expends. It says when a system gets bigger, it has to take in more energy than it expends, because you can't create energy out of no clean air. You could use any metaphor you want. Climate change, delta E equals E in minus E out, we don't care, because we want to know why the energy is getting trapped in the atmosphere. We were talking about why this room is so crowded. More people entered than left because people are conserved just like energy. But that's not an explanation for why the room's crowded. It's something that had to happen for the room to get crowded. Okay, why explanations? There's a speaker, maybe there's free meals, maybe it's 90 degrees outside and this is the only room the air conditioning's working in. Maybe I put huge football players at the door whose job was to pull everyone in and not let them leave. There are a lot of explanations for why a room gets crowded. More people entering than leaving is not an explanation. It's a description of what happens. This is a description of what happens when people get bigger. When anything gets bigger, it says nothing about causality. This is what I meant when I said this theory is not even wrong. Okay? This is not a theory. If somebody gets bigger, they have to take in more energy than they expend. But the fact says nothing about why they got bigger or why they took in more energy than they expended. So Jean Mayer, the most famous nutritionist in the US in the mid-20th century, put it in 1954. Obesity, too many people believe, is explained by overeating. Actually, it should be recognized as simply restating the problem in a different way and reaffirming, somewhat unnecessarily, that you believe in the laws of thermodynamics. They have to be true. To explain obesity by overeating is as illuminating a statement as an explanation of alcoholism by chronic overdrinking. Imagine if I was giving you a lecture on how to get wealthy, and I told you make more money than you spend. Right? You'd laugh me out of the room. If I was giving a lecture on climate change, and I said the problem is more energy is entering the atmosphere than leaving it, I get laughed out of the room. If I'm giving a lecture on obesity and I say obesity is caused because more energy in than out, I've just given you the dogma in the field and what everyone believed until they walked into this room. It's crazy. Okay. If you begin with first principles, when you say, we had a conversation at dinner last night about this, I say you sit down, you have an obese person behind you. Many people in this room, in front of you as a patient, is going to start thinking, why do they eat too much or not exercise? So you think of it as a disorder of energy balance. But first principles, if you have somebody in front of you who has too much fat, you say this person who has too much fat, they have a fat accumulation problem. If you think of it as a disorder of excess fat accumulation, the first question you might ask is, I wonder what regulates fat accumulation. If you think of it as a disorder of eating energy, you wonder what regulates appetite and what regulates expenditure, which is where most of our research is. You know, when leptin was discovered, it was considered to inhibit appetite, because we think that's the problem. So we have a hunger gene as opposed to a fat accumulation gene. It completely determines how you think about every single piece of evidence in the field is going to be considered differently if you think of this as an energy balance disorder. It's just without any assumption a fat accumulation disorder. Why do people gain fat? It's a fat accumulation problem. In this hypothesis, overeating and inactivity are compensatory effects. I'll explain that. We don't get fat because we overeat because our fat tissue is accumulating excess fat. That energy balance equation, delta E is equal to E in minus E out. Delta E is positive energy balance. It just says this is a body that's accumulating energy. If your fat tissue is growing, that's delta E. If you're a kid and your body's growing, that's positive energy balance. We want to know what causes growth. So here's the first law of thermodynamics. The direction of causality in the conventional wisdom is changes in intake and expenditure drive changes in storage. The alternative hypothesis, changes in storage drive changes in intake and expenditure. The equation holds. We've just flipped the causality. The equation says nothing about which one of these is true. Okay, here's an analogy. This is a Gedanken Experiment. This fellow, Karl Anthony Towns, was the first #1 draft choice in the NBA last year. He's going to be Rookie of the Year in the NBA this year. There's an article in the New York Times that described him in high school. Said there just never seemed to be enough food to satiate Towns' growing body. After school, he would eat a foot-long sub before his mother's home-cooked dinners. Even after having a hefty lunch of homemade chicken, rice, and vegetables, and his favorite snack, granola bars and Bunch of Crunch. If this guy had Prader-Willi syndrome, you would say that's hyperphagia. Okay? So here's Karl Anthony Towns. He's 7 feet tall. He weighs 250 pounds. And we know that because he was growing so much, that drove his intake. Okay? No doubt about it. Now here, through the magic of Photoshop, we've created his non-existent twin brother, Anthony Carl Towns, who's 6 foot and 250. This guy walks into your office, you assume that he eats too much and exercises too little. Why? By what basis can you make that claim that Karl Anthony, change in storage causes change in intake and expenditure, Anthony Carl, it's the other way around? Purely because you think this kid has an overindulgence problem. Okay, so here's the alternative hypothesis history. The German-Austrian hypothesis pre-World War II. The leading investigators pushing it were Gustav von Bergmann and Julius Bauer. Von Bergmann was the leading authority in clinical medicine in Germany pre-World War II. Today, the leading award, the most prestigious award of the German Society of Clinical Medicine, is the Gustav von Bergmann Medal. Julius Bauer was the pioneer of endocrinology, metabolism, genetics, chronic disease at the University of Vienna, which was one of the great universities in the world, and I'm biased, my father graduated from there. Bauer came over in '38, von Bergmann stayed in Germany. If you have friends who are in the biology community in Austria, they will remember Julius Bauer. This is what Bauer said about obesity. He said, like a malignant tumor, like the fetus, the uterus or the breasts of a pregnant woman, the abnormal lipophilic tissue. Lipophilic was a term they used for tissue that wanted to accumulate fat. Okay, whether if it was on a man, it was here. If it was on a woman, it was here, or in her breasts. They use the term lipophilic or lipophilia. So the abnormal lipophilic tissue seizes on foodstuffs, even in the case of undernutrition. So you can have somebody who's undernourished and a child who's malnourished, and if their fat tissue is lipophilic, they're going to get fatter. It maintains its stock and may increase it independent of the requirements of the organism. Sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself, does not fit into the precisely regulated management of the whole organism. A lipomatous subject may die of starvation and still remain lipomatous. You could show this effortlessly in animal models of obesity. You can starve them to death and they will remain with much of their fat tissue intact. So Eric Graff, University of Würzburg, wrote the seminal textbook on metabolic diseases. Eugene Dubois, who I quoted, actually asked Graff to translate his German textbook into English. Said they described this theory as a condition of abnormally facilitated fat production, impeded fat destruction, a sort of lipomatosis universalis, in the sense that the lipophilia in certain tissues is primary and the sparing and the energy expended is secondary. So you store energy abnormally and that energy isn't available to be burned. So it's a fuel partitioning between storage and oxidation as opposed to the way we think of it between fat and lean tissue. It presupposes overnutrition. By that he meant if you have a fat tissue that wants to grow, that's your positive energy balance. And intake and expenditure are going to compensate. Russell Wilder, who was the leading authority on diabetes at the Mayo Clinic in 1938, and one of the leading authorities in the U.S., said the effect after meals of withdrawing from the circulation even a little more fat than usual might well account both for the delayed sense of satiety and for the frequently abnormal taste for carbohydrate encountered in obese persons. A slight tendency in this direction would have a profound effect in the course of time. Remember, you only need 20 calories a day to end up with obesity. The hypothesis deserves attentive consideration. Hugo Roni was at Northwestern University. He was a Hungarian emigre. He wrote the first monograph on obesity in the U.S. in 1940. He said the subsequent discovery that normal fat tissue was a site of considerable metabolic activity was looked upon by many as strongly supporting the theory, which is now more or less fully accepted, chiefly in Germany. Then the war comes, okay, and this hypothesis evaporates, and the lingua franca of medicine goes from German pre-war to English after. Again, something I knew nothing about. So prior to World War II, if you wanted to be a serious medical science, you had to be able to read German. And if you look at like Roni's textbook, a third of the references are in German, even though it's published in the U.S. If you look at Graff's textbook, 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the references are in German, from Austrian and German journals. So you can look at animal models of obesity and ask yourself, if you calorie restrict these animals or pair feed them with lean animals, will you get obesity anyway? Will they at least get fatter, even if they're not allowed to overeat? And in virtually every animal model you look at, you'll see this. If the researcher thinks to see what happens when they pair feed the animal, they'll find that the animal gets fatter, even when it's not allowed to increase its intake. And as Jean Mayer said, not about this mouse, I just like this picture. He was studying obese strain of mice. He said they'll make fat out of their food under the most unlikely circumstances, even when half starved. So if obesity is sort of excess fat accumulation or hormonal regulatory disorder, the natural question to ask is what regulates fat accumulation? The Germans couldn't do this because they didn't have the technology available. 1956, 3 groups of researchers discovered assays to measure fatty acids in the circulation. 1960, Yalow and Burson invent the radioimmunoassay, and in the next 10 years, there's an explosion of research on fatty acid metabolism, much of it done by Yalow and Burson. Here's the focus of attention. What you want to know is, why does this fat cell get fat? Okay, that's where the energy balance matters. It's like, ask the question, and I proposed this to one of the people we had dinner with. You should do as an experiment. I want to know why this fat cell gets fat. So here's my experiment to any students. All I can see, ask yourself, what does the fat cell see? What signals does it get? What does it see on the membrane? What enzymes, what hormones, what central nervous system? And create a theory of obesity from the fat cell's perspective. Because what you want to know is, why does this fat cell, wherever it is in the body, accumulate excess fat? And it doesn't know how much the person whom it's in is eating or exercising, although it sees the hormonal metabolic responses of eating and exercising. Okay, so this was worked out by the 60s. This diagram is actually from Keith Frain's metabolic regulation textbook, just to show you that what Yalow and Burson had realized by 1965 was still considered mostly true. 2010. So insulin is a principal regulator of fat metabolism, and this is Frayn's textbook, hormonal regulation. You can see insulin, 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 insulin. Insulin. So if you were asking why this adipose tissue gets fat, you might start with the idea that there's somehow, if there were too much insulin, you're going to drive fat into it, you're going to inhibit mobilization. Okay, release of fatty acids from fat cells requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. Simple 1960s endocrinology, no genetics, molecular biology, just, okay. And you know that today. I mean, conventional wisdom. This is from a 2001 textbook. It's available on the NIH website. Overall action of insulin on the adipocyte is to stimulate fat storage and inhibit mobilization. This is a photo of a young woman who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 17, and for the next 50 years gave herself her insulin shots on the same two spots of her thighs, and this, developed these fatty deposits. So they say the remarkable effects of locally injected insulin on the accumulation of triglyceride into adipocytes. So here's the key points. Again, overly simplistic, I know. But when insulin is secreted, a chronically elevated fat accumulates in fat tissue. When insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue and the fat depots shrink. Okay, conventional wisdom, textbook science. We secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet. Try not to use words like carbohydrate, because now I'm stemming into Actate's diet land, right? Okay, up until now, like, it's getting better, but it used to be I'd get to this word and people would go, oh my God, he's a quack. He's going to tell us carbohydrates are fattening. George Cahill was at Harvard, leading diabetologist. In 1965, he co-edited an American Physiological Society textbook on the revolution in understanding of fatty acid metabolism that had happened over the 10 years. And as George said, carbohydrate is driving insulin, it's driving fat. Okay, textbook science. If you take out these three words as driving insulin, you have carbohydrate is driving fat, which is the logical equivalent, and now you're in quackery land. Okay, so textbook science, take out these three. You end up with quackery. And it's interesting. Okay, this is textbook science, like I said. So here's Lenin's principal biochemistry. If you ask the question, what makes fat cells fat? So you go to the index, look up in the adipocyte, tell you high blood glucose elicits the release of insulin, which speeds the uptake of glucose by tissues, favors the storage of fuels. Glycogen, triglycerols are inhibiting fatty acid mobilization. Then why do people get fat? Because they take in more calories than they expend. This thinking is so powerful and so dangerous that even people who understand why a fat cell gets fat think it is irrelevant to why a human gets fat. And I've had conversations with people who study fat cells, who when I said, what if the possibility that the same thing that makes a fat cell fat makes a human fat? And the response is, I never really thought about that. Okay? You can find hepatocytes, not adipocytes. It's an article about fatty liver disease in Science. So when a liver cell, hepatocyte gets fat, you say carbohydrate intake increases glucose and insulin levels, which activate transcription factors in the liver that promote de novo lipogenesis. Insulin inhibits lipolysis in adipose tissue by suppressing, okay? So when you're talking about hepatocytes, it's cool. We're going to talk about how carbohydrates drive insulin and all the, and even we might even get into fructose and sugar and everything else. When you're talking about adipocytes, it's an energy balance. So here's the alternative hypothesis. Like any growth defect, obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder. Okay, like any growth defect. If you could find one that's driven by how much people eat and exercise, please let me know and I will fix this slide. Like type 2 diabetes, it's fundamentally a disorder of insulin signaling or dysregulation, hence diabesity. Why are these two disorders so intimately associated? Maybe because they are indeed flip sides of the same coin. And then the controversial part is triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. Okay, not all carbohydrates. This is where you get in trouble. There's two different ways that this might happen. If you look at high GI carbohydrates, okay, highly refined processed grains, elevate insulin, quickly digested, high blood sugar, and then the sweets with fructose-rich carbohydrates. The fructose is metabolized in the liver. There's some evidence, I would say significant evidence, that maybe sugar is driving insulin resistance. Once you're insulin resistant, all these other things become bad. The problem is, see, this is a food guide pyramid, right? So in the 1960s, when we decided dietary fat caused obesity, we decided dietary carbohydrates were heart-healthy diet foods, okay? Until the 60s, we had a different belief. I'll show it to you quickly. So here's the alternative hypothesis. Refined grain, starches, and sugars. Remember, we have to explain the obesity epidemic, too. Dysregulation of insulin signaling, excess fat accumulation, obesity, and the obesity epidemic. It's a different paradigm. I hate to use that word, but it is a different paradigm than the energy balance paradigm. Implications. How to decrease excess adiposity. You remove the fattening carbohydrates and lower insulin. Okay? Should any of this be surprising? Conventional wisdom through the 1960s was that carbohydrates were uniquely fattening. Okay, Tanner in the practice of medicine, farinaceous, that was starchy foods and vegetable foods are fattening, and saccharin especially. So I could quote 50 books and articles from the 1960s to 1963, including famous books like, I can't remember the name, the football again. This is the first sentence, an article in the British Journal of Nutrition, 1963, written by one of the two leading British dietitians. Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. It's a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. In the course of my research, I found 4 major medical schools that published diets for obesity in the medical literature in the late 1940s, 1950s. So Harvard Medical School, Stanford, Rush in Chicago, and Cornell. They were all variations on this diet. It was published by Raymond Green, who was a leading British endocrinologist, in his 1951 textbook. Raymond Green was the brother of Graham Greene, for those of you who like to read. This was before the realization of insulin resistance that came with Yalow and Berson's research. Foods to be avoided: bread and everything else made with flour, cereals, potatoes, foods containing much sugar, all sweets. So the idea was these are fattening. They didn't know why they were fattening, but there was something inherently fattening. And you can eat as much as you like of the following: meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs, cheese, fruit, except bananas, because these foods were not fattening. And again, they didn't know why. They don't say eat smaller portions or 800 calories or 1,200 calories, because it wasn't about how much people ate or exercised. It was don't eat these foods, have fun with those. Some people cannot tolerate those foods, that's why they get fat. Insulin in relation, fatty acid mobilization, oxidation in relation to insulin. It's a threshold effect. As insulin in the serum comes down, you get to a certain level, and fatty acids are dumped into the bloodstream and oxidized. Okay, kind of a simplistic way. This is Ralph DeFranzo's work. I think he was still at Yale in 1990. So this suggested that if you really wanted to make sure you were mobilizing and oxidizing fat from your fat cells, you wanted to be below that threshold. And the way to do it is to get rid of all the carbs and replace it with fat. And now you end up with the Atkins diet. And then the A goes after Atkins in 1973 because he's pushing a high-fat, high-saturated fat diet during a period of time when we would really believe saturated fat caused heart disease. They, 2 people who wrote this, thought that Atkins was killing people legitimately. So this has been tainted with quackery ever since. The weird thing about it is it says fat is mobilized when insulin secretion diminishes. And yet, low-carbohydrate diets are bizarre concepts of nutrition that should not be promoted to the public. I have a 1965 New York Times article which all my year equates promoting a low-fat diet, high-carb, low-carb, high-fat diet to the public is akin to committing mass murder. Okay, and yet, if you want to get fat mobilized by diminishing insulin secretion, what better way to do it than remove the carbohydrates and replace it with fat? Okay, the end result, they wanted to get rid of Atkins. They got rid of the science of fat accumulation, and from the 1980 or so onward, everybody's talking about energy balance. The actual hormonal metabolic regulation of fat cells. How many of you have written articles about obesity? How many of you discussed what that Keith Frayne slide showed in your articles? Okay. I mean, you're writing about a disorder of fat accumulation. Don't you have to talk about the regulation of fat accumulation and fatty acid oxidation? Isn't it the first place you're going to look? And yet, we have probably hundreds of thousands of articles. And in some way, it's funny. It's because of Atkins. He read the same literature I did 50 years later, created a diet that other people had created before him based on this literature, was accused of quackery in the obesity research community, which was very small and tight back then. Basically 6 very powerful individuals said, this is unacceptable. Okay. What happens if you put people on low-fat diets, low-carb, high-fat diets? Just because I know it scares people. You get significant decrease in body weight, body mass index, abdominal circumference, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, plasma triglycerides, fasting glucose, glycated hemoglobin, plasma insulin, plasma C-reactive protein, and an increase in HDL. You remove the carbs, particularly the refined processed carbohydrates and sugars, in effect, metabolic syndrome goes away, arguing that these are the cause of metabolic syndrome, because you don't have to restrict calories in these diets, because it's not considered. People who think this way don't think in terms of calories. The problem is you end up with a diet that's might raise LDL. So you still say, however, the effects on long-term health are unknown. Anyway, why were these populations fat? I raised that question. I've run really late. I'm sorry. Most third world countries have a high carb intake. Ralph Richards was a British diabetologist who opened a diabetes clinic in Jamaica in 1960 or so, and in 73 reported at a conference in London that 2/3 of the adult women in Jamaica were obese. You know, extreme poverty. It's conceivable that the ready availability of starch and preference to animal protein, contributing as much the main caloric requirements of these populations, leads to increased lipogenesis and the development of obesity. That was my apologies to Jean Mayer. Anyway, I'm happy to keep answering questions. I know that many of you are going to have to go because I went over, but you know, thank you. You just keep going.
We have some time for questions, please.
Hi, Gary. I'm Paula Nedved, and we've corresponded, but here's Gary's book, and you know, my husband and I both read it clear through. It's like a mystery story. At first we thought, no, we can't read this, but then we went clear through. I read it twice, and we lost 25 pounds in 6 months. His high blood pressure, he lost the need to take pills, gastric reflux gone. We got down to our marriage weight when we got married in 1980. We kept it off for 6 years. It's just true. We eat low carbohydrate, high fat, plenty of bacon and eggs. And another thing that hasn't been mentioned here that I think is not good to consume much of at all is like juice, like orange juice. It's, you know, everyone, fruit is wonderful, grains are wonderful, but anyway.
A question? You have a question?
Yeah, my question, how would you describe what happens, the information cascade that happens? I think that's an important thing for people to know why they stay believing something that they could find out pretty easily isn't true.
Well, it's funny. There's a lot of economists like my argument because they like the idea that there's science out there that's worse than macroeconomics, and I'm blaming, saying nutritionists. So there's an economist at Yale, political economist, who described the problem with this idea as a $100 bill on the sidewalk idea. Okay, so you're walking down the street, the busy street. This is an economics parable, and you see a $100 bill on the sidewalk. You just bend down to pick it up. Okay, because a lot of people have walked by. Clearly, if that $100 bill was real, somebody would have picked it up already. So it's either fake or there are tiny strings attached and candid cameras hidden, and as soon as you bend over to pick it up, somebody's going to pull it out of the way. So an economist just walks by that $100 bill. What I'm arguing is that a very simple, horrible mistake was made. when we embraced this energy balance idea that obesity was basically solved in the 1960s by, you know, for all intents and purposes, I mean, maybe not all of treatment and all of therapy, but at least dietary trigger. That's the $100 bill. It's almost assuredly wrong because it's too easy. These things don't have simple solutions or they don't persist. So people, the natural thing to think about is this has to be wrong, because if it was right, surely somebody other than you, you know, whoever you happens to be, would have found it. And that's a very compelling argument. You know, it's a very compelling argument. And that's why the purpose of this lecture is I want you to question your own beliefs about energy balance, whether everything I've given you as a replacement is right. The idea is to get you to leave with thinking, can I really look at an obese person again and think they got that way because they somehow ate too much and weren't physically active?
Question back here.
So, I mean, biology is complicated, and there can be different causes for the same thing. So, like some people who are obese, it might be because of an endocrine imbalance. And I'm not sure if you're particularly focused on saying it's a particular subpopulation that has particular dysfunctional regulation, or are you trying to argue that it's the population in general? Because
Well, there's another-
I can stop eating, and clearly I'll lose weight. And I can
Absolutely.
eat more, and clearly I won't gain weight. And it doesn't make a difference whether it's carbohydrates or not. So I'm not sure.
Well, no,
Wait,
wait, stop that thought right there. Maybe it does. You don't know that. You don't, that's the experiment you do, right there. That's the experiment you do. You put
That's probably my main staple. I know if I stop eating other things.
Well, one of the
I'll lose
issues,
weight. So,
yeah.
But again, everybody's different.
No,
One of the things
let
I'm
me-
asking
let
is,
me-
are you trying to say that your paradigm is supposed to be do you think it's really a general paradigm, or do you think it explains a subpopulation maybe that particularly has difficulty with obesity?
Okay, so here's the issue. First of all, I'm a physicist. I studied physics. I was a lousy physicist. I'm a huge believer in Occam's razor. Okay, if you start from the assumption that this is a multifactorial complex disorder and everyone is different, you will never solve it. Okay? So you start with a simple explanation. You ask yourself, can the simple explanation solve it? And if it can't, how do I have to start adding epicycles? Or do I have to find a different explanation? So the first assumption, when I showed that chart of all those obese populations in poverty, is they're obese for the same reason we're obese. That's my assumption. Occam's razor. Same disorder, same cause. Remember, we have an epidemic that's worldwide. Okay, the obesity and diabetes epidemic has exploded in not just Caucasians in the US and African Americans, but you can find it in Inuits, you can find it in African pastoral populations, it's out of control in the Middle East, it's exploding in Asia. You know, if this was lung cancer, we're not out looking for multiple causes, we're blaming it all on cigarettes. So let's begin with the hypothesis. I mean, when I just finished this book on sugar, and it was fascinating, I was reading how in the 70s there was a lot of debate about whether sugar caused diabetes, and the compromise was sugar caused diabetes in people who were predisposed. But then the question is, what if nobody gets diabetes who isn't predisposed? If you add sugar to a population, you see diabetes. If you don't have sugar, you don't. Maybe the predisposition tells you who's going to get it in that population, but the cause for all of them is the sugar. So what I'm saying is you can tolerate the carbohydrate content of the diet, just like 9 out of 10 people who smoke will not get lung cancer. But the 10th, cigarettes caused it. And so the argument of similar causality for those people who get obese, and we all have different predispositions, it's the refined grains and sugars that trigger it. Maybe somehow the eating more, surely if they get obese, they're going to be hungrier, just like a growing child. Carl Anthony Towne is going to be hungrier because they're growing. But you don't know which way the causality goes. And before I would assume that they suffer from gluttony and sloth and you don't, which is an assumption as a journalist I never want to make, I'm going to assume that they're trying just as hard as I do to control their weight. And in fact, they're trying to eat healthy. And the world is full of people who have never been to McDonald's and are still fat. So yeah, I think it is a general principle, and I think if you think in terms of energy balance, you'll never solve it. And if you think in terms of hormonal, metabolic, endocrine, cellular levels, you then have a way to solve this problem.
Two last questions, Ben first, and then
Thank you for the good lecture. So I have a question. I think I agree with him partly because I think there's an overgeneralization here. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist.
You're going to have to speak up a little. I'm a little
Sorry.
deaf.
Okay.
Could
So
also be football.
I'm saying that there are some conditions such as Prader-Willi syndrome, which you mentioned, where they are born thin, but then they begin to gain weight at age 3.
Before the hyperphagia shows up.
Right. And then, so their weight goes up. Now, there are other conditions like leptin gene mutations, where they can't stop eating and they are overweight. Melanocortin 4 receptor mutations, where they cannot control their appetite and they gain a lot of weight. So I'm saying there are scenarios where this will not obtain. Whether you feed them low carb or high fat, it doesn't really matter.
No. Well, first of all, let me give you an example, because the eating and the weight gain. So you're assuming, like with the leptin deficient, they can't stop eating and they gain weight, and you're assuming that the can't stop eating is the cause of the weight gain. And I'm saying, what if you assume that the weight gain is the cause of the can't stop eating? In Prader-Willi syndrome, we actually want to fund a study on Prader-Willi. Prader-Willi is fascinating because the hyperphagia in Prader-Willi is so extreme, it's hard to imagine it doesn't cause the obesity, right? I mean, these parents have to lock the cabinets, they have to lock the refrigerators, they have to lock away soap and hand lotions so their kids don't eat it. They have to flush the toilets after the kids have a bowel movement to make sure the kids don't eat that. That's how hungry these kids are. They're born with floppy baby syndrome. They have a lack of lean tissue in early life. Then the weight gain starts before the hyperphagia manifests itself. So you can't really blame the weight gain on the hyperphagia. And then, on top of that, they have virtually no lean muscle mass. So unlike normal obesity, where about a quarter, 20% of the excess weight is lean tissue, in these kids, it's clearly a fuel partitioning disorder. And one of our goals, and on top of it, ketogenic diet is now spreading through the Prader-Willi community, and was shown even by Bill Dietz of the CDC when he was at MIT in 1970, that you feed these kids a ketogenic diet, the hyperphagia goes away.
So we have to stop because there's another class coming in here. People can meet with
I'm happy to.
Gary. Can you take Thank you, Gary.